Hey, good afternoon. My name is Laurie King, and I'm a professor of anthropology at Georgetown University, and I'm also very pleased and honored to be one of the academic advisory board members for the Arab Center in Washington. And it's a pleasure to be here, especially at the end of the day, because it's a time when we can start to think about how everything fit together, and I think that this panel will really do a remarkable job of pulling together some of the strengths. And as you've heard before, you've got cards on your table. So if you have just joined us, these Q&A cards are available. You can complete them at any time and hold up the card, and one of the staff members will come and collect them from you. And you can engage with us online if you are listening to this in the ether by using the hashtag ACWDC2017. And now I'll introduce the panel members in the order in which they're going to speak. First, we have Dr. William Lawrence. He's a professor of political science and international affairs at the George Washington University, and he previously served in senior positions at the U.S. Department of State, the International Crisis Group, and the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy. He has received 6 superior and meritorious honor awards from the State Department, 2 medals from the Egyptian government, and a Distinguished Alumni Achievement Award from Duke University. He is a regular guest on multiple U.S. and Middle Eastern radio and television programs and has published extensively in Foreign Policy, The Guardian, the Oriental Institute at Oxford, and others. And then next we will hear from Ibrahim Fraihat, who is an associate professor at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies and an affiliate scholar at Georgetown University. Go Hoyas. I think we have a number. George. Georgetown, Georgeless. All right, so he previously served as Senior Foreign Policy Fellow at the Brookings Institution and taught international conflict resolution at George Washington University and at George Mason University. Fraihat has authored books and published extensively on Middle East politics in the New York Times, Christian Science Monitor, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, and others. He is the recipient of George Mason University's 2014 Distinguished Alumni Award and is also the 2017 N.D. Kondratiev, I hope I'm saying that right, Medal Laureate for contribution to the development of social sciences. And then after Dr. Fraihat, we will hear from Dr. Marwan Kabalan, who is head of policy analysis at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies in Doha, where he also chairs the Gulf Studies Forum Committee and Contemporary Syria Studies. Previously, Dr. Kabalan served as Dean of the Faculty of International Relations and Diplomacy at Qalamun University in Damascus, Syria. He has also taught at the University of Manchester and at Damascus University. He is a regular contributor to several Arabic and English language newspapers and is the author of several books and articles on Syria and the Middle East. Next, we have Dr. Ellen Laipson, who is the director of the International Security Program at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. She joined GMU after a distinguished 25-year career in government and as president and CEO of the Stimson Center. She also serves on a number of academic and other non-governmental boards related to international security and diplomacy and is a weekly columnist for worldpoliticsreview.com. A member of the Council on Foreign Relations, Laipson currently serves on several advisory councils, including the International Institute for Strategic Studies, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and Georgetown University's Institute for the Study of Diplomacy. And last but certainly not least, we will hear from Rami Khouri, a political columnist and book author and professor of journalism at the American University of Beirut, where he was the first director and is now senior fellow at the Issam Faris Institute. He is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. Mr. Khouri has been a fellow and visiting scholar at multiple universities across the US and Middle East, and is also a recipient of the Pax Christi International Peace Prize. So, Mr.
Was it?
Mr. Lawrence.
Yes. It's very nice to be with you here today. I'd like to thank the organizers for organizing an extraordinary and unusual event here in Washington, particularly with the combination of speakers that we have today. And I'd like to thank the previous speakers for saying so much of what I think this panel intended to cover, that it's made our task a little bit easier because we can sort of further develop these themes that have been expressed throughout the day. I'd also like to say that I'm a little bit out of my comfort zone by choice, in that I normally comment on North Africa, and if you'd like to see my views on North Africa, I was privileged to have one of the articles in the booklet available today. But today I'll be talking about the Trump administration, which, when I travel frequently overseas, is the first, middle, and last question I get, how to navigate and understand the Trump administration. So I'm going to give you all some ideas today about that. At an event last Monday at Hudson Institute, Stephen Bannon, the executive chairman of Breitbart News and former White House chief strategist, spoke about Trump's speech in Riyadh, which he said was the greatest foreign policy speech ever given by a US president. I teach diplomatic history. I don't know if I'd include it in the top 100. I do like to compare the two Cairo speeches. It's very instructive to compare, for example, Condoleezza Rice's speech and Obama's speech in Cairo, for example. That gives you some very interesting fodder for a class discussion. But I took another look at the Trump speech again last night, and one of the things he did call for was the eradication of ISIS during his term as president. And what was interesting about the Hudson Institute event was that every single speaker, Petraeus, Panetta, and all these people were talking about a generational or multi-generational struggle against ISIS and ISISism and ISIS 2.0 and 3.0 and the like, not something in the next 4 to 8 years. But here we are. He also went on to say that the greatest security problem the world is facing is not North Korea, is not Iran, or Russia, or China. He said the greatest security problem was Qatar. And in particular, the desire of Qatar to get along with all of its neighbors. Now, I was involved in Qatari diplomatic training up at the Fletcher School for several years, and we used to teach the Qataris, make friends with all of your neighbors. You know, you'll succeed as a small state. Well, they took our advice and have excellent relationships with a whole range of groups. And as Petraeus pointed out during that event, had the Taliban 5 and Hamas in Doha by agreement with the U.S. and Western powers and acted as an interlocutor. But now this is being billed as a case that somehow Qatar supports terrorism and the like. But there are deeper problems at here. We had another Hudson Institute event a few weeks before. There have been several there. But one was particularly striking to me, where one of the leading strategists from, I won't get his name, but one of the think tanks in Washington, when confronted with the issue of what is the response to this idea that Iran is and Qatar are the cause of all the problems, what is the alternate strategic vision that can be put forward? And this person said on camera in front of a big audience, he said, I don't think in terms of strategy anymore. I don't find that useful. And it's no longer possible, he said, or fruitful in a long-winded answer. So we've gotten to this point where there aren't alternative strategies being articulated. We've sort of devolved into this hyperbolic and bellicose exchange of ideas without really rethinking a lot of these issues. In the piece, you'll see in the booklet for today, I do talk about North Africa briefly with two interesting vignettes. One was when the Italian foreign minister came to Washington in April and pleaded with the Trump administration to engage more on Libya on a range of issues. I don't know if you know the French defense minister and others have come to Washington saying Libya is the biggest strategic threat to Europe, or things flowing from Libya, and apparently Trump didn't put his earpiece in for the translation and contradicted almost 180 degrees, said the opposite of what the Italian prime minister had said, saying that the U.S. wasn't going to be engaging on Libya and the U.S. was in too many places in the world anyway, which was seen internationally as a big diplomatic gaffe. And there was a flurry of statements. In fact, I called my contacts at the State Department and people who deal with the White House, and so a series of statements came out sort of resetting Libya's strategy on the correct path, that we're supporting the political solution. And some of the things we heard at lunch today, but they sort of scrambled to reset things. Another moment was the budget that they articulated in late May, but it wasn't really discussed in Washington until July, where they were going to slash by about half Tunisia aid. I mean, of all the easy lifts for any administration post-Arab Spring, with all the trouble we have, I mean, it's an easy one, is Tunisia, and they were going to cut it by half while not cutting Jordan aid. It always happens that the Tunisian money goes to Jordan, and it has to do with the way lobbying works in Washington. But as was mentioned at lunch, there is a sort of a congressional backlash going on, led by John McCain and Lindsey Graham and Leahy and others, to restore the Tunisian assistance, sort of getting us back on track a little bit. Let me also just say in passing, before I get to my main body here, that I'm disheartened when I hear, and I heard it a couple times this morning, when I hear Libya and Syria lumped into the same category as a disaster and a disaster caused by U.S. military involvement. Libya is not a story of a military engagement gone awry. It was a story of a successful military engagement that wasn't continued. And when Obama said his greatest regret as president was what happened in Libya, what he was referring to was that there was just what we heard in the first keynote speech today, that there wasn't continuity and some sort of stabilization force, not that the original mission had failed. And if you look at what has happened in Libya, I mean, you have 500,000 dead in Syria. You have 1 or 2% of that in Libya. You have a war where nobody kills each other. A number of interesting things have been happening lately in the administration that weren't noticed. So, for example, while the U.S. was decertifying Iran, it was certifying Sudan. I don't know if you noticed this rapprochement through AFRICOM over a similar, in fact, even wider and tougher set of issues on Sudan. And while it was placing North Korea and Chad on the Muslim ban list, it was removing Iraq from the ban list. And when administration officials were asking about Iraq being removed, did I say Iraq? Yeah, Iraq being removed, they said, well, Iraq's doing a better job of vetting. You know, what's changed with vetting in Iraq? And Iraq is strategically important, therefore we need to remove them from the Muslim ban list. So what's going on with that? Well, Sudan and Iraq coming off the Muslim ban list and a number of other things, I would say as a result of these factional struggles going on within the administration. And if you look at the various writing on factions, there are 9, and I'll surprise you with a 10th. But there's the Bannon wing, the Pence wing, the generals, the family wing, the Friends wing, the Republican Party wing, the Wall Street wing, the bureaucrats, the others, and then I'll get to one. And they're often conflicting, often leaking, but also have various sets of agendas. The Bannon wing was the strongest early on. They're anti-establishment, anti-immigration, nationalist, anti-multilateral, anti-trade deals, but they've been decimated. Bannon's gone, Gorka's gone, Flynn's gone, he was part of that wing, and Miller's the only one left, and he's made an alliance with the family members. And so a number of the issues they were promoting are being expressed in a weaker way. I have a lot more to say on that. This is a forthcoming article. The second one is the Pence wing. The Pence wing is halfway between the Bannon wing and the conservative establishment. Betsy Davos is in it, Mark Short, Scott Pruitt. There's a set of conservative values. They want smaller government. I think Huckabee Sanders has joined that, the type of conservatives they like. And they are in assent for a number of reasons, but one is, and I'll skip ahead here, the Republican wing, the Priebus is gone, Spicer's gone, Katie Welsh is gone, the Republican establishment is gone. And so increasingly, the the part of the White House that's dealing with congressional liaison is the Pence wing. And this group, just to sort of get back to Huckabee Sanders again, sort of, they don't have much of an agenda other than smaller government and moral values, but they like to attack, right? They're comfortable in that attacking mode. The generals are in ascendancy, and enough has been said about that in the media. I'm not going to belabor the point. But they want more engagement with NATO, with Russia, building international alliances. They're willing to contradict the president internally and externally. Mattis goes out and will say the opposite thing the president was saying. Kelly worked quietly against the Muslim ban. There's all kinds of interesting things. And as was said this morning, so I won't belabor the point, but it's important, the generals don't want generals running U.S. foreign policy or the government. And they're trying to put themselves out of business to the degree possible by making the case for State Department and the USAID and other parts of the U.S. government. They have not won that argument yet. The fourth faction is the family. I'll focus just on Jared and Ivanka briefly. Jared, one of the two crown princes, as was mentioned this morning, has a huge set of portfolios, Middle East peace, China, reforming the whole government, over a dozen. But there's not much going on there. There's not much occurring, and I'll get to what to do about it at the very end. But Ivanka, on the other hand, her main issue has become women's empowerment. And she occasionally will put a check on her father's worst impulses. And she's allied with Dina Powell, who I'll get to in a minute. She's a key here, and if Jared and Ivanka survive the Russia investigations, I think they'll continue to play an interesting role here. In the friends category, I put Dina Powell, I'll put a whole set of lawyers, and Omarasa Manigault from The Apprentice. She had to be put in check by General Kellery because she kept putting negative press about Trump in front of him and stirring him up into these tweet storms. And she had to be put in check. But the other friends, it's quite interesting. And Dina Powell in particular, if there's the shakeup we may be expecting, if Tillerson departs, there's a good chance whoever comes, Nikki Haley or Pompeo comes to state, if this happens, Dina could end up as UN ambassador. And keep an eye on her because she's not Republican establishment as much as she's friend of Ivanka. And I think she's got some staying power as long as Ivanka stays there and understands the issues of our region well as an Egyptian American, particularly on the humanitarian side. Skipping ahead to the seventh group, the Wall Street wing holds a corporate agenda which opposes a lot of the populist and nationalist agenda. The most in view are Stephen Mnuchin and Cohn, who almost left over the Charlotte protests. But this group occasionally allies with the generals to have, let's call it an internationalist, a responsible internationalist agenda. The eighth group is the bureaucrats. There are 1.8 million of them, and contrary to a lot of the Trump and media reporting, they don't do most of the leaking. Most of the leaking is done by other factions in the White House. The federal bureaucrats are mostly too scared for their jobs and want their pensions. And generally, when they do object, and they resign and they write a letter. And there have been really interesting letters from, for example, the head of the White House ethics the government's ethics office, or the chief scientist of the EPA. When they left, they wrote these very eloquent letters. The State Department dissent cable was in that category, and so and they're powerful. There's also some very interesting data. 62% of federal employees supported Hillary, and 28% supported Trump. There's a much larger group of Trump supporters even than residents of D.C., Northern Virginia, and the D.C. suburbs of Maryland. And so you do have, and I know a number of them, strong Trump supporters in the government, and they have an interesting interaction with the others. There's the other category, I won't go deeply in it, Kellyanne Conway, Donald McGahn, but Tillerson is the main one. And Tillerson isn't really in any of the camps. He occasionally allies with the generals, occasionally allies with there was the Suicide Pact, but I don't think there's too much to that. He allies with the Wall Street crowd, but he's rather independent. He got in big dispute over the appointment of his deputy, Elliott Abrams, so there's no deputy. He got in a big fight over other staffing issues, and he's been contradicted by Trump on very on several occasions over North Korea diplomacy, over Qatar diplomacy, and yet has survived. Again, we don't know how long it'll last and whether Nikki Haley or Mike Pompeo will come in. And he has done some damage at the State Department in terms of agreeing to the budget cuts and not staffing up sufficiently, and yet, as I've seen from every administration I've ever worked for in government or when I was in government, there's always a long learning curve, and the longer Tillerson stays, I expect the better things will get at state on a whole range of issues. Even Hillary Clinton made huge errors in her first 6 months as Secretary of State, and I could tell you stories if you ask me offline about how she fixed all of her early errors. I mean, this is common for new secretaries of state. So how do we navigate this? Do I have, 2 minutes left or one? Or, I haven't seen any signs. Yeah, how do we navigate this? Number one, 1 minute? Okay. 1 minute. Number one, we need to, all of us, foreign policy establishment here today, we need to talk to the conservative groups. I've gone 3 times to the movement meeting, over Norquist groups where all the young movement conservatives go. I've made the case for Tunisia, for Libya. I mean, there's an open door to talk to these, and I think we helped save the Tunisia funding previous years by doing that. Similarly, we need to talk to people connected particularly to the friendly group, right? The generals, the family, the friends, to some degree, the Wall Street, the bureaucrats. The cut in Egyptian aid came from the bureaucracy, right? Engagements in humanitarian assistance, massive for Yemen and Syria, that came from the bureaucracy. The fixing of these gaffes I talked about came from them. So empower the bureaucracy, embolden. Information is currency in government. The more information you give to the bureaucracy itself, it helps. Number 3, talk positively without sugarcoating about Arabs and Muslims, and we heard about why during the second session this morning. Number 4, find ways to propose engagements that are low cost, high impact, the language they speak. Number 5, deal with the congressional staffers. 30 seconds. Deal with the congressional staffers who have huge power and can restore various kinds of funding. Skipping ahead, argue for diplomacy and development. There are concrete examples of how it works. Global poverty has been cut by half in recent decades. This youth bulge we're hearing about, that's because mortality rates are declining by half. I mean, it's half as much of a decline as the drop in the fertility rates. Huge successes in nutrition, sanitation, medicine. I mean, there are big developmental successes we can talk about. And finally, there's a 10th faction. And increasingly, the NSC and these different factions are speaking with one voice to the president. One voice on JCPOA, one voice on North Korea. And Trump is increasingly becoming a faction of one. Now, I have no idea what the solution for that is that, other than these tweet storms, these responses to Trump aren't the way to go. We have to aim high and aim for the higher angels. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Lawrence. And next we're going to hear from Ibrahim Fraihat.
Thank you very much. Not sure what's left after all the talks all day, what to cover, but we'll think of something for that. Well, first of all, I am an international conflict resolution specialist by training, but since I moved from Washington to the Middle East 6 years ago, I haven't resolved any conflict. So they're still going on. And my friend Rami was telling me that you need to check your conflict resolution work again. Then I said, maybe that's why we called our program that we started recently as a conflict management program, which is a sign of that our business is booming, unfortunately, in the region. So that's where we're at the conflict management. So we'll try to talk about things that help us with the conflict management, because I think it's still very ambitious to talk about resolutions, especially lasting resolutions for the conflicts in the region and for the U.S. policy in the Middle East. I will focus on the main pillars of the Trump policy in the region, and how this, since this is our session is about policy recommendations, how things can be done differently. The very first thing is about the illusion that ISIS has been defeated. I don't think so. I don't think this is This is like what our great speaker, Joanne Bolaksik, during lunch spoke, that ISIS has been defeated. I think this is an illusion. Maybe Baghdadi was defeated, but terrorism definitely not defeated in the region. And there is a huge difference between defeating an organization and defeating the phenomena. It's a big difference. To understand this, actually, we need to look at, at the historical context, where terrorism actually started like the 1.0 during the 80s in Egypt with the Jama'ah Islamiyah and all of that. And since it was dealt with strictly on a security ground, without any dealing with the underlying causes of the phenomena, it was defeated during the 80s, but replaced with terrorism 2.0 in the 90s with al-qaeda. And later, during the defeat of also the other illusion of defeating al-qaeda, later on, this was replaced with terrorism 3.0, which is ISIS that we know today. That, as you see, each version comes much more violent than the previous one, which all three phases were dealt with strictly on a security ground, without, again, the way we advocate in conflict resolution is that dealing with the underlying causes and conditions of a phenomena in order to end it. So I totally disagree with her that taking an indicator that ISIS lost Mosul and Raqqa as an indicator that ISIS has been defeated. In fact, I think this is what the Trump administration and the international coalition did. Actually, they sent ISIS back to its nature, which is a terrorist organization is not supposed to be doing governance in Mosul or in Raqqa. It's not supposed to be dealing with water and electricity and education and health and all of that. And this is actually the main difference between Baghdadi and Ayman al-Zawahiri from al-qaeda, that over their mission of whether they should be taking control and establishing governance or just staying to their loyal to their nature as a terrorist organization without governance. And if anything, I think the Trump administration just proved Ayman Zawahiri is right, and that Baghdadi is wrong. Right? That's what I see the outcome of this war. In order to deal with this, I think that's the very starting point here is that Syria. Syria is dealing with a political solution in Syria, which is, by the way, is taking a whole different direction than the way it should take in order to deal with terrorism or something else. I remember in 2011 and 2012, we were always talking about the price of inaction. Right? If you think that Syria was not at the core interest of U.S. interest in foreign policy in 2011 because it wasn't directly touching on or affecting directly the U.S. interest, there will be the price later, right, of inaction and not taking any action for that reason. And just 2 years later, actually, we started to see ISIS, and that's emerging, and that's what got U.S. foreign policy back involved again. So I think we are probably at a similar stage now where under the illusion that terrorism has been defeated and then just leave Syria, whether it's on a Chechnya approach, of a Russian Chechnya approach, of creating a loyal government and thinking that this is going to take care of it. And I haven't seen any actually clear definition of, again, going back to our great speaker during lunch, Joanne Bolaksik, on talking about a credible process owned by the Syrians. This is just very general talk that lacks any definition of what this means, actually. Who owns the process in Syria now is Russia. Right? It's not the Syrians who own the process. It's not the Syrian opposition. It's the Russians who are, the Russian government who owns the process at the moment. So I think what needs to be done again to avoid the mistakes of the terrorism 1.0 and terrorism 2.0 before. If you think that you achieved a military or a security solution, a military victory, you really need to deal now with the more difficult part, which is the political process and the underlying causes that produced ISIS, which is, again, a genuine, credible, inclusive, right, solution in Syria that differs entirely than the way it is taking place now. Now, the other thing is, the other major pillar of Trump's foreign policy is about countering Iran in the region, because that's what we have seen most of the talks talking about ISIS and Iran. And I think here we're seeing another pattern emerging. During the Bush administration, George W. Bush was talking about countering Iran and ended up giving Iraq to Iran. And then we saw also the Obama administration giving Syria to Iran. And I think now the way that probably we're going to see is that Trump is going to give the Gulf region to Iran. So that's, I think, the emergence, the pattern that's emerging that we're seeing. I mean, everyone knows that that this current crisis started right after the Riyadh summit and the green light given by the Trump administration to the current crisis to happen. And that is so far, and the only probably beneficiary from the current crisis has been Iran. And that's what leads me to think, actually, that the pattern is repeating itself again with, 2 minutes or 1 minute. So Trump actually is shooting himself in the foot, right, by trying to counter Iran by actually, with this Gulf crisis, is that ending the unity of the GCC and dividing the GCC, and actually Qatar, whether you like it, Iran, whether you like it or not, is benefiting from this. I don't think canceling the nuclear deal is the solution, or a military confrontation or a war with Iran is the solution. And I agree with Sullivan, who talked about these issues. I think that the solution, like to work with, to stop the Iranian expansion in the region, and it should stop, is one, a political solution, as we said in Syria. And the second important thing is a credible government representative of all of its people in Iraq. Because that's also the other major, let's not forget, the other major contributing factor to the emergence of ISIS in Iraq, that we had a sectarian government in Baghdad, supported by George W. Bush here in Washington, D.C. That led to the emergence of crisis, and I promise to end. The third thing, very quickly, like on Yemen, we're talking, in the previous session, talk about complicity. Well, believe it or not, there is now Saudi Arabia is being blacklisted by the United Nations on human rights violations in Yemen of killing children. And this is going to establish a legal path, for how this is going to be dealt with in Yemen. And I think the U.S. will be part of this if this continues. And on Palestine, freezing the settlements, at least if you're unable to solve the crisis. Let's remember that only the Republican administration, the George Bush, the administration, that really put serious pressure on the Israeli government to end or to freeze the settlement activities in Palestine. And I think this is the minimum where Trump can do something to be in line with the Republican line of foreign policy in the past, where otherwise the Palestinian Authority is on the verge of collapse, and another thing will blow up in his face, and then we'll have to deal on another level. And sorry for taking.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Dr. Kabalan. Next, we will hear from Dr. Ellen Laipson.
Thank you. Like Barbara, I'm not really entitled to that honorific, but I'm happy to be with you. And I thought that maybe what we need to do is not just make recommendations for the United States, but maybe make recommendations to both the Arab elites and American elites who talk to each other, and see if we can improve the connectivity in how we frame the issues in the region. So it sounds to me like you've heard a lot during the day about the strangeness of this particular moment, of the very unusual character of the current administration that takes pride in not fitting into pre-existing categories. So whenever we analysts try to say, oh, no, that's not the way things are done, or don't you know about, this context or past, it really doesn't resonate as a course or help the administration sort of say, oh, well, now I understand, I'll get back on track. To the contrary, they take great pride and pleasure in this concept of disruption. And I think we have to just be honest and clear about this, that we should have no illusions that some great clarity or coherence is about to emerge in US policy, not only towards the Middle East, but towards almost everything. So it's a moment of enormous discomfort, I would say, if not worse, for foreign policy folks who really do deeply care about America's role in the world and how to keep it being a force for good in the world and not have this quality of recklessness and uncertainty. But the president enjoys the disruption. He sees value in being an agent of change where the changes are sometimes unpredictable. So I would just say, tighten your seatbelts and here we go. It's not going to change. I think there's not going to be some moment where it all falls into place and we can say, aha, now we know. Here's the framing of American interests in the region. So much has been said about can he check the box on terrorism? And I very much appreciate and agree with Ibrahim's comments that of course not. Of course, the nature of the threat will mutate and morph into something else. It doesn't go away that quickly, but it gives Trump an opportunity to say, I've finished, I can take that one off my list and now I can move on to something else. He can give the illusion or the impression that he can now move to something else. And I do sense that in his conversations with Sunni leaders, there has been this discomfort that focusing on the Islamic State has somehow been postponing or avoiding the showdown with Iran. So they see that the emphasis on the Islamic State is somehow has a little anti-Sunni flavor to it, and so there's an opportunity for Trump to put that aside and then focus in greater depth on all the friction between the United States and Iran. I personally don't think that he, really understands, and as we all know, his advisors have been very carefully trying to move in the direction of minimizing the actual harm that is done to the Iran nuclear agreement. But we haven't heard the last on US-Iran policy. My great worry is that I think the Arab side has also stimulated President Trump in his first visit to the region with a vocabulary that to me is also sometimes veering in the direction of irresponsible. I personally am uncomfortable with making Iranian hegemony, and this morning I heard the phrase Israeli hegemony, as if the Arab world is a sort of passive victim to all these terrible external aggressors. And I think we need a little more honesty and a sense of responsibility. The Arab world, in the end, controls vastly more territory, resources, people than either Iran or Israel, and yet the presentation to the US is that there's somehow this great crisis and threat and that the Arabs are somehow without any blame or responsibility for the state of affairs. So I would like to propose a little more honesty and openness in how we frame the issues. Having said that, I'm now going to say two paradoxical things. One is American power is, in relative and absolute terms, contracting. It's been happening for a long time. I mean, President Clinton was the first post-Cold War president who kind of embraced globalization and a change in the international system as a positive thing. Every president since Clinton has seen, well, and I would say Obama also was willing to embrace a more globalized world in which power was distributed differently than it's been in the past. But other presidents have seen this as an ominous and dangerous world where they've tried to reassert American authority, but in so doing have actually created insecurities. So I think that power and authority is shifting and contracting. If we look at U.S. diplomacy, just in the last couple of weeks, Tillerson left a second time empty-handed trying to mediate the Gulf dispute. We were apparently close, according to some reports, to helping Prime Minister Abadi and President Barzani of the Kurdish region avoid the calamity that befell them, but U.S. diplomacy was not sufficient, even in a case where we have enormous, in theory, leverage and influence on both the Kurds and the Iraqis, the Iraqi Arabs. We could not avoid that. So those are just two very recent examples of the thinness of American diplomatic clout and authority. And I don't blame this on Tillerson or the Trump administration. I think it might have happened under any administration. At the same time, I think there is still a demand for an American active engagement in the region, and particularly continuity in the security relationship. So my perception is that there is still a demand, that is still, in general, a positive arena for U.S.-Arab cooperation. But I just wanted to pick up on two other thoughts that have come up during this day that I thought were useful. I really appreciated the previous panel, the discussion of economic integration and whether, in the absence of any predictability in the official government-to-government relationships right now, whether the business community, private sector actors, there's so much investment and economic engagement between the United States and the Gulf region and other parts of the Arab world, keep that as a point of continuity in the relationship. And lastly, I would say civil society, we just see more and more, whether it's educational institutions, cultural, health exchanges, et cetera. We are seeing, as one general observation that one could have made at any point during our discussion, is that not all power and influence resides in the nation state. People are empowered in networks, in organizations, in non-governmental organizations. There is more transactional activity going on, and even when we can't quite understand where our own governments, yours and our U.S. and Arab governments, are necessarily heading, we can keep a more positive sense of shared interests and engagement alive. So why don't I just stop there?
Thank you very much, Ellen. And our next speaker will be Dr. Marwan Kabalan.
Thank you very much. Because the title of this session is Recommendation to U.S. Policy. In fact, when I started thinking about the sort of recommendation a guy like me coming from the Arab Middle East would be giving to a U.S. administration, I thought maybe the best way to do it is to define U.S. interests and objectives in the Arab Middle East and then try and give some tips to this U.S. administration about how best they can serve their interests. And I'm doing this because over the past 15 years, and precisely since the invasion of Iraq in 2013, I believe because whenever the U.S. creates the mess, we pay the price and we become collateral damage. So I thought perhaps if we give the U.S. some directions that would contain the damage that at the end of the day we will be paying. So this is what I decided to do actually, and I started in fact from the Riyadh summit and the Riyadh speech by President Trump. In the Riyadh summit, President Trump defined two U.S. interests and two U.S. objectives in the Middle East. Number one is isolate Iran, and number two, defeat ISIL. In these two objectives, of course, I mean, there was no clear strategy at that time, especially for how to isolate Iran, but in fact, indeed, I mean, there is a lack of strategy on US policy on other regions and global issues, but particularly in the Middle East. The Trump administration has not only been lacking a strategy, it's in fact pursuing policies that are counterproductive, most often producing the adverse effects. So I started with the Riyadh summit with the two main objectives of the Trump administration. So just a few days after the summit ended, the blockade of Qatar and the Gulf crisis broke out. And that was a window for the Iranians, who were supposed actually to be isolated and contained, to perhaps have more friends and become less isolated. So they immediately found a common ground with the Turkish government that they would in fact counteract any move by Saudi Arabia to isolate Qatar or to take any aggressive action against Qatar. And when I came to the United States, actually, the Qatar Airways that I was using, they used the Iranian airspace. And Qatar is also now using, the only access, in fact, that is available for Qatar today is through Iranian territories. So they get actually food and medicine through Iran. This is why Qatar decided, in fact, to send their ambassador, which was withdrawn in early 2016 after the burning of the Saudi embassy in Tehran. Because you can't actually ask your neighbor to give you access to provide you with medicine and food and not having normal relation with that neighbor. So what I'm trying to say actually is, whereas the strategy was to isolate Iran, today Iran is having more friends in the region than it did a few months ago. And when President Trump actually realized the damage that has been done to his strategy and decided to change course and offer to mediate between Qatar and Saudi Arabia and Emirates, well, he discovered the limits to his power. His allies actually are not listening to him. They are not heeding the call. So I think that was also, in my opinion, a message, or not what was a wrong message, in fact, because if your allies, if you don't have influence over your allies, how would you expect your enemies to do what you are asking them to do? So this is why I believe one recommendation to US policy is try and solve this crisis, because, as I said, it's making more friends for Iran on one hand, and on the other hand, it's undermining the credibility of the United States. So this is number one. Number two is the war on ISIL. And I believe that the security and military approach seems to have paid off. ISIL army of terror seems to have been defeated in Syria and in Iraq. It lost most of the territories it had captured following the fall of Mosul in June 2014. However, ISIL was an idea before it became an army or a Khilafat state, al-Baghdadi declared from the pulpit of the An-Nuri Mosque in Mosul in June 30th, 2014. It was an idea that emerged out of exclusion, marginalization, and oppression driven by sectarian policies. Hence, I believe if al-qaeda was a blowback from the policies of the Cold War in Afghanistan and elsewhere, and US support for authoritarian regimes in the Arab Middle East, ISIL was a blowback from the invasion of Iraq and its domination by Iran-backed sectarian militias. If the very idea of ISIL is to be defeated, the deep roots of the phenomena must be tackled. Indeed, as we have seen repeatedly, the US is so good in winning wars, yet its performance in nation building, save post-war Germany and Japan, is very poor indeed. And if the US destroys ISIL, declared mission accomplished, and leave without healing the wounds of the war, we are risking the emergence of a much worse version of ISIL, as my colleague Ibrahim has just said. I believe that help rebuilding the state and society in Syria and in Iraq is the only way to prevent the re-emergence of ISIL. Building also functioning democracies in these countries in which all people from all ethnic and sectarian backgrounds can have a say and hope for a better future is also instrumental. In brief, we need a Marshall Plan for the Middle East if the US wishes to fight no more wars in the region. It needs to win the peace, and peace needs long-term commitments. And I was scared when I heard the ambassador, on lunch, when she said that we are not going to fix the problems of the Arab world, and we are not into the business of nation building. I think that is a grave mistake, because this is a prescription for indefinite war. The United States is going to involve in the Islamic world. So I believe that security and stability in the Middle East in this interconnected, globalized world cease to be regional and local issues. It indeed affects international security and nations as far away as the United States. Help re-establishing security and stability in the region serves world security and stability. It indeed serves US interest and prevent the region's two main commodities at time of civil and sectarian wars. These two main commodities are refugees and terrorism. Finally, we are likely to get stuck with another blowback, actually, from the war on ISIL. In my opinion, US support for Kurdish factions in Syria and in Iraq is likely to turn the sectarian conflict in these two countries into an ethnic one. In Syria, the rise of Kurdish aspirations is likely to unite Arabs, regime and oppositions alike, to regain lost territories to the Kurdish forces. Arabs will be most probably supported by the trio of the Asatana process, i.e. Russia, Turkey, and Iran, against the US-backed Kurdish forces. Not only this would set the stage for more conflict in the region, but would also benefit the foes of the United States, who knows better how to manipulate local politics, as we have seen recently in northern Iraq. US backing of Kurdish factions would help further cement the emerging Turkish-Iran understanding that received a push from the blockade of Qatar. Although a regional alliance, in my opinion, is unlikely to emerge between Turkey, Iran, and Russia, cooperation between these countries is in the rise, and the common denominator is animosity towards US policies. Needless to say that China is also sympathetic, and Pakistan seems also to be weighing its options following the recent aggressive remarks by President Trump. Indeed, US policies are leading to major shifts in regional alignments across the region. They are, however, formed to counteract the exact policies that are leading to their formation. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And last on the panel today, we'll be hearing from Mr. Rami Khouri. Rami?
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be involved in this conference, and I'm very happy to have had the opportunity to share this panel with this extraordinary group of presentations, all of which have taught me a lot. My focus, when I looked at the title of our panel, which is US Policy Recommendations in the Arab World, when you break that down, there isn't really a single US when it deals with foreign policy, as we've heard. Certainly there isn't a single Washington policy right now. And there isn't a single Arab world. And I think we need to go back to basics, which all of us have said in different ways. We've got to go way back. And I was fascinated throughout the day, including at the lunch talk, where everybody, no, not everybody, many people mentioned that we need to go to the underlying factors. And even during the lunch talk, which I thought was quite intriguing in so many ways, there was a mention, the speaker said that it was decades of dysfunctional political systems that served elites and did not meet people's needs in the Arab world that brought us to this situation. And it was one of the few things that were said at lunch that I agreed with, but I think it was actually correct. But why do people in Washington or throughout the Western world or throughout the Arab political elites actually explore that? And this is what I've been doing for the last 40 years or so in my work as a journalist in the Arab world, trying to understand what's going on. And what we see is there is no Arab world anymore. There is a region populated by 400 million people who are citizens of Arab countries. And I don't even use the term Arab world, I just talk about the Arab region now, because it isn't an Arab world in any way other than a linguistic demographic description. There are 5 Arab worlds, in my view. There's a small elite of rich, wealthy people and professionals who are very well off, take care of themselves, they've got homes abroad, so they're fine. That's about 10%. These are all my estimates. There's a middle class of around 30% roughly, I would say, and these are either government employees they have a pension, they have a health insurance, they get help with housing and education, whatever, and so that's its kind of middle class, we can call them. There's another I would estimate, of the 400 million Arabs, about half of them, 50%, I would call them low income, poor, marginalized, and often desperate. And we have evidence for that in the latest Arab Center poll, which showed that 78%, that's like 4 out of every 5 Arabs is living in hardship or in need. In other words, they can just barely cover their monthly expenses, but they have no cushion, probably don't have insurance, probably don't have pension, or they can't even cover their monthly expenses. 78% of the Arab world is living in hardship. So I think my estimate is about 50% of the Arab world, I'm being conservative, is really living in great distress. And then there's another 10%, which I would call either the people, and the last 10% are people who are beyond the realm of the state. They have either immigrated, including many in this room, and my kids, and many of us who are family members, they've left. They won't have anything to do with what's going on over there. Or they've left the realm of the state and they've formed militias, they've formed tribal groups, they've formed subnational sovereign militant entities that are in some cases like Muqtada Sadr negotiating with big powerful Arab countries. So there's roughly 4 Arab worlds that are completely separated from each other. And what we're seeing, and have been seeing for the last 40 years, I would say, is the second great fragmentation of the last century of the Middle East, or at least of the Arab world. So the first one, of course, was around World War I. And the creation of the modern Arab world, the invention of the modern Arab world, happened starting around World War I and has pretty much held for a century. The borders, they've been shaken here and there, but they've pretty much held. We're now in the second great fragmentation of the Arab world, which is an internal fragmentation, and it's been going on really since the 1990s. It was the end of the Cold War, in my view, as I lived through this in the Arab world, that saw large numbers of people slowly give up on the state because the state couldn't give them what it had given them from 1920 to 1990, and basically were looking for other sources of livelihood. And therefore, the region started to fragment. It's also no accident. Fragment internally. So within Lebanon, you have Hezbollah. Within Syria, you have all these other groups that emerge now who've been fighting, the Houthis. And as states collapsed in Yemen, and you have the Houthis and others. So internal fragmentation and new sovereignties, new authorities, and new identities emerging. And as it's no accident that 100 years ago, the caliphate was ended, and 3 years ago, the caliphate came back. At least somebody who thought they had brought back a caliphate. So the quest for a caliphate and a caliph and some kind of Sunni collective moral leadership, or whatever you want to call it, reference point or something, is still happening 100 years later. And my point is, my concern is that 50% of people who are poor, marginalized, and often desperate. And we know from the last 30, 40 years or so that it's these people who have left the umbrella of state sovereignty, because the Arab world essentially has failed, for the most part, has failed the twin tests of statehood and sovereignty. We have been amateurs at statecraft, and we have been erratic in our performance of sovereignty and delivering to our citizens what they expect from a citizen-state relationship. And therefore, we've turned to militancy, whether it's the governments, like the Saudis and the Emiratis in Yemen, the Syrians, the Iraqis, the Libyans, internally militancy against their own people, or militancy attacking other people. And the failure of our statehood and sovereignty was best exemplified 2 weeks ago when the Russians, the Turks, and the Iranians, and Hezbollah was tucked in there somewhere, were meeting to decide on how are they going to deploy their troops inside Syria. Inside Syria, not outside Syria. How are we going to work inside Syria with these non-Syrian troops? It's an extraordinary process. And it was just barely mentioned in the international press. So we have a serious structural deterioration in statehood, which is only camouflaged a little bit by the wealthy Gulf states who have a lot of money, and in the other states it's not camouflaged at all. It's very obvious. These societies are fragmenting. And we see this in tons of statistics, which I don't have time to mention, but I'll just mention a few very quick ones. Population fertility rates, which had been dropping for the last 20 years, from 3.3 to 2.2% population growth rates, fertility dropping from 6 to 3 or so, are rising again in some Arab countries. Egypt has 2 million new citizens every year. There's 9 million new Arabs born every year. There's no way the Arab world, with its present management, can give these people what they deserve as citizens. I mentioned 78% live in hardship or need. Around 25% of people over 18 want to immigrate, and around 35% of people aged between 25 and 30, two-thirds of people aged between 25 and 30 are thinking of immigrating. These are extraordinary statistics. 50% of elementary and secondary school kids are not learning how to read and write. They're failing the basic tests of proficiency. 25 million kids in primary and secondary school who should be there they're out of school for various reasons. They're not learning anything, they're not finding jobs, there's a war going on. 25 million are out of school or will drop out in the coming year because of wars, and around 75 million are in school, half of whom are not learning anything. So we have a mass of people, probably around 100 to 150 million people, who are unable to do anything with their minds because they haven't been trained to use their minds in school. They're doomed to a life of informal labor. About 60 to 65% of labor in the Arab world is informal labor. No insurance, no pension, no safety measures, people who can only do menial work. There's massive structural problems that these statistics and many other statistics capture. If you look at water, about 2/3 of all the Arab countries are in severe water deficit already, let alone what climate change is going to bring. And there's many others which we don't have time to get into, but if you look at the statistics, the data from every sector of life, you look at housing, you look at public transport, you look at trust in government, something like 65-70% of Arab youth feel that corruption is rampant and can never be resolved in the Arab world. And this is where we are. My 3 recommendations, we clearly need much more than just tinkering with what's going on. We need a radical change in the exercise of power and the status of citizens in their own states. That's easy to say, it's hard to do. But it's been done in other countries. The South Africans did it, the Northern Ireland people did it, the Burmese almost did it, and they fell back. Other people have done this. And certainly the Americans did it 240 years ago. So the way to do this is that we need a serious effort by Arabs and non-Arabs to sit down together to discuss these structural issues that are fragmenting the region and eroding it and emptying it from within, and find ways legitimately for international parties to engage with Arab parties to bring about the changes that we all know we need, so that the ultimate goal that we can achieve is the consent of the governed, which would slowly lead to perhaps better governance, socioeconomic opportunities, and then slowly roll back this tide of 40 years of fragmentation, leading to this great internal hemorrhaging that we're experiencing, which nobody in the Arab world at policy level or in the international arena is addressing in any serious way, other with cursory references to we need to look at the root causes. The root causes are a collapse of the 100-year order, including 4 to 8% of Arabs, meaning 16 to 32 million Arabs, who tell pollsters they think ISIS is doing a good thing, let alone the ones who don't dare to tell it. So these are serious, frightening issues, but they're made by humans, they can be fixed by humans. Thank you.
Thank you, Rami. Well, thank you to all of the panel members, and we have some questions. I've got a couple of questions that were for the entire panel, but also some that are for individuals, and I'll start with a question for Ellen. The question is, could you please explain who created ISIS and organized 100,000 militants and equipped them with the latest technology of arms and vehicles in Iraq?
You want to just take them one at a time, or do you want to do them as a group? I think she's telling you 2 minutes to wrap up.
Oh,
so.
2 minutes to wrap up.
Just one or two questions.
One or two
Fire off
questions.
a couple of questions.
Yeah, why don't you do it?
All right, another question. This one is actually for Bill. You seem to be optimistic about the potential for a settlement in Libya, but what about the role of General Haftar? Isn't he a divisive figure, especially so for the Tripoli faction?
And one more.
This one is for the panel. After 6 decades of nonstop duplicity, why does the United States continue to view Israel as an ally and a friend?
You can go first, Ellen.
Yeah. So quickly on ISIS, I think we do have to trace the American invasion of Iraq, the collapse of trust among Sunnis, the radicalization of Sunnis that were then able to work with the remnants of al-qaeda and create the Islamic State. Access to technology and weapons, I think, happened because ISIS was smart enough to exploit available local resources, not because they were handed on a silver platter from any outside actor. But I think it is the intervention in Iraq that led to the rise of the Islamic State.
On Libya, I ran a simulation in the intelligence community about 2 years ago, training 50 intelligence professionals, and we had 16 parties for Libya. I included ISIS and Haftar, and to make a peace deal for Libya. And ISIS was the first to defect, and Haftar was second. Haftar had no good reason to make a deal, in part because of the geopolitical factors backing him. There's a deal that can be made. I think the best argument for it is that Libyans are trying very hard not to kill each other, including Haftar. And even though Haftar had many failings, like not stopping Daesh when it crossed through his territory, and there's a lot of speculation about why, he also didn't attack the Western factions very much either. And there's been several meetings. Basically, the Khairat deal needs about 4 things fixed. And Saleh has a decent plan. I'm only more optimistic about Libya than I am about Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. But I'm not that optimistic because it needs a huge amount of international political effort to make a deal on Libya, but it's eminently more solvable than the other crises I mentioned.
Yes.
I'll answer the one on the U.S. and Israel. The other thing that happened 100 years ago in a couple of weeks was the Balfour Declaration. And the Balfour Declaration and the growth of Zionism and the birth of the State of Israel was one of the first great interventions in the Arab region that created non-Arab power. And the Israelis have been far more effective than the Arabs have been at statecraft and statesmanship, despite all the criticisms we make of them. But they've been much better at running their country than we have at running most of ours in the Arab world. The Iranians, the Turks, and the Israelis, the three non-Arab powers in the region, have their own problems, but none of them have problems anywhere near the Arab world. But the efficiency of Israel, its ability to engage with the United States diplomatically, and many structural issues in the Western world, the role of fundamentalist Christianity, of course the Holocaust and the extraordinary support that came to Judaism, Jews and to Zionism, to Israel because of the Holocaust crimes. All of these things came together, but in the final analysis, the Israelis managed their statehood better than we managed ours, and one of those elements of that is their ability to achieve power that supports them in Western capitals, starting with London and then moving to the US. The interesting thing is this is now starting to fray. Only in the last 10 years have we seen signs of the fraying at the edges of the powerful pro-Israel support that exists, that genuinely exists in American culture, and it's slowly being contained more in the Congress and in the presidency, depending on who the president is. But when you look at professional associations, labor unions, the media, education, across the churches, mainstream church, when you look across the United States, there's a much more balanced approach. People want Israelis and Palestinians to have equal and simultaneous rights. So I think the trend is moving in the right way, but it's very slow. So resolving, my fourth point, which I ran out of time, was, my fourth recommendation was help resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict equitably for Israelis and for Palestinians and other Arabs whose lands are occupied, because the Arab-Israeli conflict has been the oldest and most destabilizing force in the region for the last 100 years. I have no doubt about that. And the evidence we heard this morning and other evidence that comes out of surveys constantly shows this. So those people in Washington or in Riyadh or other places who think that Arab Gulf states and Israel making an alliance are hallucinating, because the popular sentiment is to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict and then look at other issues.
Thank you very much.